All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into what is, hands down, the most explosive debate in the history of social thought: human population growth. I mean, think about it. Have we simply grown too much, or are we actually just hitting our stride?
So here's the massive million-dollar question we're wrestling with today. Are human beings basically a burden on this planet's finite resources? Are we just totally doomed to eventual starvation and collapse? Or is the human mind our ultimate resource? Can we literally innovate our way out of any scarcity problem faster than we create it?
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we're going to hit the Malthusian doom equation. Then, we'll look at Boserup's idea that innovation overcomes scarcity. After that, some serious geographic detective work with Jon Snow. Then we'll tackle how population policies actually shape demographics. And finally, the ongoing population debate.
All right, part one, the Malthusian doom equation. Let's kick things off with the absolute granddaddy of demographic pessimism. Back in 1798, a young English clergyman named Thomas Malthus published an essay that has pretty much haunted geographers ever since. His arguments about scarcity were actually so incredibly powerful that they helped crystallize Charles Darwin's entire understanding of natural selection. Darwin realized that the intense struggle for existence Malthus was talking about, it was universal. Now, Malthus built his whole argument on a really strict mathematical premise. He looked at two things as absolute, rock-solid facts. One, humans need food to survive. And two, well, the passion between the sexes isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Because of this, he argued that unchecked human populations multiply geometrically. They double, right? 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, boom. But agriculture, Malthus said food production only creeps up arithmetically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You really don't need a math degree to see that the first sequence is going to completely blow past the second one.
To put it in his own famously stark words, the power of population is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. Malthus deliberately weaponized this cold, rigid math to burst the bubble of Enlightenment optimism. You know, everyone at the time thought society was marching toward perfect happiness, and Malthus steps in and basically says, yeah, no, the math simply doesn't allow for that.
And that grim math leads us straight into what's known as a Malthusian crisis. It's that unavoidable, terrifying outcome when a skyrocketing population violently hits the ceiling of our food capacity. Malthus honestly believed that if we didn't actively use preventive checks, think delaying marriage or strict abstinence, then nature was going to step in with positive checks. And nature's checks, they are absolutely brutal. We're talking famine, widespread disease, and war. These miserable events would aggressively spike the death rate until the population was dragged back down into balance with the food supply.
Now, what's really interesting about this number, 8 billion, that is our global population today. Back in 1800, right around the time Malthus was writing, the entire world population was only about 1 billion. So based on Malthus's strict doomsday logic, an 8-fold increase should have sparked catastrophic, world-ending famines over and over again. But it didn't. Actually, not only did the population totally explode, but per capita food availability went up. It's wild, but the world today actually produces more calories per person than it did in 1798.
This massive real-world failure of Malthusian pessimism was captured perfectly in a legendary bet back in 1980. On one side, you've got Paul Ehrlich. He was a neo-Malthusian who wrote The Population Bomb and famously, though totally incorrectly, predicted mass starvation in places like India. On the other side, you have economist Julian Simon. So Ehrlich bet that population growth would cause the prices of 5 major industrial metals to just skyrocket over a decade because of severe scarcity. Simon, though, bet that human ingenuity would expand our effective supply and actually drive prices down. Fast forward 10 years, all 5 metals had dropped in price. Simon won the bet. Ehrlich had completely underestimated human innovation. He totally missed things like the Green Revolution, spearheaded by Norman Borlaug, which engineered high-yield dwarf wheat and rice and literally shattered that Malthusian ceiling.
Okay, moving on to part 2, Boserup, and how innovation overcomes scarcity.
So the crucial point here comes from 1965, when a Danish agricultural economist named Ester Boserup looked at the exact same data as Malthus and boldly flipped his entire pessimistic theory on its head. She argued that population pressure isn't the trigger for a devastating crisis at all, it's actually the primary stimulus for agricultural intensification. Simply put, necessity is the mother of agricultural invention. See, Malthus thought farming tech was completely static, but Boserup, who did a ton of field work in developing countries, realized that farmers are highly rational problem solvers. When land is plentiful and there aren't many people around, sure, Farmers take the easy route, but when population density shoots up and land gets incredibly scarce, farmers are literally forced to invent, to adapt, and to work significantly harder to squeeze more food out of the exact same patch of dirt. You can actually track how this adaptation unfolds through Boserup's 5 stages of agricultural intensification. When populations are low, you start at stage 1, forest fallow. Farm a spot briefly, then leave it alone for decades. Easy. But as that population pressure really starts to build, societies are forced down this list. They leave land fallow for shorter and shorter periods, eventually hitting stage 4, which is annual cropping. Finally, in incredibly densely packed populations, sheer necessity drives them all the way to stage 5, multi-cropping. That means pulling 2, sometimes even more harvests a year from the exact same soil, which requires massive irrigation and intense management. This beautifully explains why historically dense regions, places like Java and China, don't just starve, they survive and thrive through hyper-intensive farming.
Let's shift gears to part 3, Jon Snow's geographic detective work.
Because, population theories aren't just abstract academic debates about farming. Sometimes understanding populations in physical space is literally a matter of life and death. I want you to picture this. It's late August 1854, the Soho district of London. It is an absolutely terrifying time. Over 500 people have just dropped dead in the span of 10 days, all clustered in this remarkably small, tight-knit neighborhood. It was a horrific cholera outbreak. Now, at the time, the overwhelming scientific consensus was something called miasma theory. Basically, the best experts in the world thought the disease was spreading through bad, foul-smelling air. Enter Dr. Jon Snow, a physician who suspected that this whole bad air theory was complete garbage, and he approached the crisis geographically. Snow literally walked door to door tracking the victims. He plotted every single fatality as a tiny dot on a large-scale street map. And almost immediately, a crystal-clear visual pattern jumped out. The deaths formed a tight, deadly cluster right around the Broad Street public water pump. He even hunted down the weird anomalies, like there was a brewery right next to the pump that had 0 deaths. Why? Well, Snow figured out the workers there only drank the brewery's own private well water and their daily beer ration, obviously. Meanwhile, a widow who lived miles away in a completely safe area caught cholera and died. Why? Because she loved the taste of that specific Broad Street pump water so much she had it specially delivered to her house. Crazy, right?
And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute power of spatial data. On September 8, 1854, armed with nothing but his map, Snow convinced the local authorities to simply take the handle off the Broad Street pump. Just remove it. And guess what? The epidemic subsided. Snow proved definitively that cholera was waterborne. He totally bypassed the standard bedside clinical observation just by using location as his data. This single, clever act is universally considered the birth of modern epidemiology and laid the absolute groundwork for the geographic information systems, the GIS tech, that we use to track everything from HIV to COVID-19 today.
All right, let's move to part 4 and see how this builds into shaping demographics through population policies. So, going from historical problem solving to modern governmental engineering. Governments today don't just sit back, cross their fingers, and let populations grow or shrink on their own. They actively try to manage the numbers. Let's look at 3 incredibly different approaches. France and Singapore both run pronatalist policies. That means they actively want to increase their birth rates. France has actually been pretty successful at maintaining a decent fertility rate by offering massive social support, stuff like cash payments and heavily subsidized childcare. Singapore, on the other hand, tried to reverse its low birth rates with a big 3 or more campaign, throwing baby bonuses and massive tax rebates at citizens, but Singapore perfectly proves that financial incentives often totally fail when put up against the harsh realities of a highly urbanized, ultra-expensive society. Their fertility rate is still hovering incredibly low, right near 1.0. Then, of course, you have China down there on the bottom row, enacting the strict anti-natalist policy to forcefully decrease birth rates because they were terrified of completely outstripping their resource capacity.
China's one-child policy, which ran from 1980 all the way to 2015, is undeniably the most radical demographic intervention in modern history. Just looking at the neutral facts of its legacy, it did achieve its primary goal. It averted tens of millions of births. And interestingly, that actually accelerated their early economic growth because the state suddenly didn't have to support a massive generation of dependent kids. However, the long-term legacy costs are incredibly severe. Today, China is staring down a rapidly aging population, a shrinking modern labor force, and a highly skewed sex ratio. And even though the government recently shifted gears to a 2-child and then a 3-child policy by 2021, the birth rates there are literally still continuing to drop.
Finally, part 5, the ongoing population debate. We've covered the history, the geographic methods, the extreme government policies, but honestly, this argument is far from over. The push and pull between Malthusian pessimism and Boserupian optimism is the exact same framework we use to argue about our future today. I mean, today's neo-Malthusians aren't just panicking over wheat fields anymore. They are laser-focused on finite planetary climate boundaries. They argue that the atmosphere's capacity to absorb greenhouse gases is a hard physical limit that we are violently pressing up against. But on the flip side, you have modern Boserupians who look at those exact same global pressures and see the sparks of our next massive technological leap. They're pointing to vertical farming, AI-driven precision agriculture, and lab-grown protein as the vital, game-changing innovations that our current demographic and climate pressures will inevitably force us to create.
So we end right back where we began, but with the stakes higher than they have ever been. As we aggressively push against the limits of our planet, will sheer necessity drive our next great innovation? Or have we, finally, actually run out of room? Are you a Malthusian, looking at the cold, strict math of a finite Earth, or are you a Boserupian, betting it all on the absolutely limitless potential of human ingenuity? Look around the world today, weigh the evidence for yourself, and decide. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will see you next time.